And without further ado, I'll introduce Liz. Liz is a director of the Amber Group for those of you that haven't met her, and she is our resident HR expert in all things agency employment law. So over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Paul. Okay, well, hi everyone. Thanks for joining. As Paul said, this is a short session today on what managers need to know about employment law on a day-to-day basis. Now, the timing for this is important because this month several employment law changes came into force under the Employment Rights Act, and there are more planned later this year and during 2027. Now, the key thing to note here is there isn't one single reform. It's more of a shift in direction over the next few years towards more fairness and flexibility within the workplace. So there's going to be greater emphasis on things such as individual circumstances, reasonable adjustments, and including employees in your decision making. What you're likely to see within the workplace is employees being given more rights earlier on in their employment. And this includes areas such as stronger safeguards around family matters, around health, and in raising concerns about matters in the workplace. And we're going to look at those in more depth later on. There's also going to be more scrutiny about the decisions made. It isn't just about the actual decision, but how that decision was arrived at. And this is going to increase expectations on managers because their day-to-day decisions will now carry more weight, and the way they handle situations is therefore more likely to be challenged. So the overall expectation is that businesses will act fairly, they'll follow a fair and reasonable process and make decisions that they can justify. So over the next 20 minutes, I'll give you a practical overview of what that looks like, what could go wrong, and how to make sure your managers understand and are doing things correctly. So why is this important to your business? Well, in the creative services and PR environments, it's fast-paced and it's client-driven. Goalposts regularly shift and decisions are often made quickly. The way of working is collaborative and informal, and while that's very good for a day-to-day working, it can mean that processes aren't always followed consistently. Additionally, the issues that managers deal with are rarely clear-cut. So, for example, if you have an employee and they've been progressively underperforming on a client account, it may not be immediately clear whether that's a capability issue, whether it's due to workload pressure, or whether it's something else entirely. So that then raises the question, well, what do managers need to know to get this right? And we're going to look at that now. There are three main areas I'm going to talk you through, which are connected to the changes that have come in under the Employment Rights Act. The first of this is a shift towards more rights applying from day one of employment, and that includes things like family-related leave. So, for example, the latest change is that employees now have the right to take paternity or parental leave from their first day of employment, whereas previously they may need to have completed 6 months or a year's worth of service. I just want to also add that was a new right introduced last year that maybe not everyone's aware of, called neonatal care leave and pay. Now, this gives parents who have a child who is born who needs neonatal care for more than 7 days within the 28 days after the child is born, it gives them the entitlement to additional leave and in some cases statutory pay. Flexible working, well, that's been around for a while, but that has also been enhanced. So just so that everybody's aware, flexible working, the right to make a request is now a day one right. But also employees can make up to 2 requests in a 12-month period. Now that was actually introduced last year, but it's still part of the shift towards greater flexibility. So overall, what we're seeing now is less of a distinction between the entitlements of new starters and longer-serving employees. So as an employer, it's important that your policies and your practices reflect these changes and that your managers understand what those obligations are and what they need to do. For example, some of the businesses I work with, they restrict new employees during their probation periods from accessing the same benefits as longer serving team members. Now, I'm not saying you can't do that anymore, but in some cases that may no longer be lawful. So, for example, a new joiner on their probation period may only receive statutory sick pay rather than company sick pay. But they will still be entitled to be paid sooner when they're off sick. And we're going to look at this in the next slide. Because the next area that managers need to be aware of is around absence and the management of that and well-being, because there's an increased focus on it. So from this month, there's broader access to sick pay. And that's because the waiting days that used to be in place, so the first 3 days of sickness absence, have now been abolished. So employees should now receive statutory sick pay from the first day of sickness absence rather than the 4th day. There's also greater focus on supporting well-being and particularly mental health. Employers are now expected to take a more proactive and supportive approach. So in practice, that means that, what might look like a straightforward absence might involve an underlying health issue, and that could bring additional legal considerations. So if I was to give you an example, maybe you have an employee who has had repeated short absences. And so initially that just might look like an attendance issue. But if after a conversation with them, they reveal there's an underlying health condition that's been causing those absences, that situation might need to be handled differently to how you would not handle a normal situation of repeat absences. The business will also be expected to consider reasonable adjustments and be mindful of whether the condition is considered a disability. And if it is, then there's a procedure for handling things in line with that legislation. So I'd say a helpful starting point would be to review your existing absence policies and what triggers the various stages of action within those policies, and make sure that managers aren't always applying them too rigidly. Because managers themselves will be expected to look beyond the absence and try to spot any underlying issues early. And the emphasis will be on having supportive conversations rather than relying on a standard procedure or one-size-fits-all approach. So a third area where managers need to be aware is around employees raising concerns, because there's now stronger protection if someone speaks up about behaviour or conduct or something else they're concerned about in the workplace. So the focus here isn't on the concern that's raised, it's actually how the person is treated after raising the concern. So if someone raises an issue and as a result finds themselves being treated differently or being excluded or disadvantaged, that's when there can be a legal risk, even if it wasn't the intention. So as a business, it's about creating a culture where concerns can be raised and they can be raised safely and handled consistently. And managers will need to take concerns seriously and avoid reacting to the individual. So it's crucial that they separate the concern being raised from decisions about the person's conduct or performance. They should be aware really about what might happen after a concern is raised and how any decisions made around that could be interpreted. So, for example, if an employee raises a concern about a client's behaviour and you then move them off an account and they feel like they're being treated as being difficult, that treatment could be seen as being linked to them speaking up. And particularly if that employee feels that they're suffering a detriment as a result of speaking up. For example, they've been taken off the account and now they miss out on opportunities to learn or to be promoted. I think one area I just do want to throw in, which I haven't put on the slides, is with many businesses currently restructuring, we're also seeing increased risk in areas such as redundancy, particularly where proper processes aren't followed. So even when there's a clear business reason for the redundancy, the decisions that are made, the selection criteria that you use, and the consultation process may still be challenged. So, for example, if a business was to choose a subjective criteria such as an employee's visibility, as part of their redundancy selection process, that could be seen as unfair or disadvantageous, particularly, for example, if one of the people in the pool has recently returned from maternity leave and is working reduced hours, because a year out of the business and returning on reduced hours is inevitably going to impact their visibility. So let's have a look at some of the reasons why things might go wrong. And there are a few patterns that tend to come up again and again. The first thing is acting too quickly. Managers are often under pressure to fix a situation and deal with it quickly. The problem with that is that sometimes those decisions can be made in haste. One example that I've seen several times is selecting an employee who's got a historically poor performance record or attitude, selecting them for redundancy because you want them out of the business rather than applying a fair and clear process. Inconsistency can also be an issue, so where similar situations are handled differently across the team without a clear reason for doing that. But I think the main thing, the one that I see, is avoiding difficult conversations. So managers allow issues to drift until they become worse, and then they suddenly escalate into something that needs to be taken into a more formal or serious process. A lack of documentation, that could trip you up as well. If decisions are made but there's no record of why, if that decision is then challenged later, then it can be difficult to justify. And I think underpinning all of this is the need for managers really to try and avoid reacting in the moment and to step back and think about whether they need to follow a more structured approach. Now, individually, a lot of these things might be quite minor, but if they start to build up over time, then that's when the risks start to occur. If I was to give you an example, the employee's performance who starts to dip on a client account over time. The manager's under pressure, they avoid addressing it early, and suddenly things get so bad, we need to look at maybe a performance improvement process or a capability process. So we're starting to move towards formal action. At that point, the employee mentions they've been struggling with anxiety and they've had some absences as a result of it. But there's no record of earlier conversations, there's no clear process that's been followed, and there's been no consideration of the underlying issue. So at that stage, you would have to stop, step back, possibly involve HR, potentially restart the whole process, consider reasonable adjustments, and maybe manage the situation more carefully than you would have done if a simple conversation had been happened early on. So it can end up being a lot more risky and time-consuming for you, for the managers and for the business. But there is good news. It doesn't have to be difficult, and managers do not need to have complex legal knowledge. There's some simple things that you can do to get the fundamentals right. Things such as addressing issues early rather than letting them build, being clear about expectations and consistent in how you handle situations, using evidence, facts, examples to support your decision making rather than basing it on your own assumptions. Keeping simple records. It doesn't have to be anything overly formal, but enough to explain what's happened and why. So, for example, if you're having a one-to-one with somebody, it might be worth just following up the conversation with a summary of what was discussed and the points that were agreed, and maybe actions that were agreed as well. And then keeping that on file. If you've taken notes in your notebook, you could consider maybe scanning them in and doing the same, just keeping them somewhere secure in case they're needed down the line. So what can you do to help your managers get things right? Well, what I've got here is really a very simple checklist that they can go through to make sure that they've got all the things they need before they make a decision. The first thing is, do I have evidence for what I'm going to say or do? So have I done my due diligence? Do I understand what the situation is? What's at play here? Do I have facts and examples to back that up? Am I being consistent in how I handle it? Have there been similar situations within the business, and how have they been handled? Do we have a policy that outlines how I should be handling this, and am I following this? And I would say many companies have staff handbooks, where they tend to sit, metaphorically speaking, on a server gathering dust. Often when managers come to me with a problem, I'll say, well, what does your policy say? And it hasn't even occurred to them to even look at it. But if as a business you have that policy in place, then you are obliged to at least bring that into the process. Is there an underlying issue that we're not aware of? Have we investigated that? And that often means, have we had a conversation with the people we need to have conversations with to understand the issue better, rather than just basing our decisions on our own assumptions and our own observations? And finally, before I make my decision or before I take action, is there someone I could sanity check this by? Maybe a more senior colleague, maybe someone in the HR team, just to make sure that everything I'm doing is the right thing. So really my message here is pause, check, and then act. So why is this important for your business? Well, there are some really clear business benefits from getting this right. First of all, you'll reduce the number of situations that then escalate into formal processes. And that will save a significant amount of management time. It will also lower your legal and financial risk, because if you're dealing with things earlier before they escalate, and if you're doing less formal processes, you're much less likely to be faced with a legal challenge or have to go into a settlement situation. It'll also mean that your managers are more consistent across the business in terms of how they manage their teams and how things are run. And your employees will probably respond well to that. If they think that they're being heard and treated fairly and consistently, it's probably going to be much more motivating for them, and you're more likely to get the best out of them in terms of their performance, and they're more likely to stick around. So before we finish, one of the things that I do want to do is just talk about a particular piece of legislation that tends to make managers very unsure about what to do or makes them afraid to act. And that's the Equality Act. Now, this is a piece of legislation under which there are certain protected characteristics. These are things such as age, disability, pregnancy, maternity, race, religion, sexual orientation, transgender status, and others. Now, these are all legally protected, and in practice, that means that situation involving one or more of these characteristics may need to be handled differently. So, for example, if someone's performance is actually affected by a disability that they may have, you may need to take a different approach to how you manage them, how you assess their performance. And rather than applying a standard process as you would do with other employees, maybe adjust that process. Or if you've got someone working flexibly after returning from maternity leave, the decisions you make around how you allocate workload to them, how you measure their performance, particularly given that they've been out of the business for a while, and even whether you place them at risk of redundancy if their job title is one of those that may be at risk, all of those may need to be handled a bit more carefully to avoid an unintended disadvantage. So I guess the message here is that while I've been talking about consistency, treating everyone the same isn't always necessarily the right approach. Sometimes fairness requires a more flexible or adjusted approach. So what does that look like? Well, they don't have to be far-reaching things. It could be something such as adjusting hours. So, for example, if somebody's absence has been linked to a health condition, maybe they've been out of the business for a few weeks, and it might mean something like phasing them back in on adjusted hours or temporarily under a different working pattern. Or if someone's performance is affected by a disability or another condition, you might want to give them more time to meet expected standards, or you might want to change their targets or adjust how you monitor their and manage their performance. Or if someone's working flexibly after maternity leave, it might mean thinking carefully about how you resource them and their workload, and how you set their deadlines and assess their performance, as I said previously. And if you need to modify the process, then it may be worth seeking external advice or involving your HR team if you're unsure. I do want to stress, though, that this isn't about changing the outcome. It's about changing the approach. So it's not about lowering standards. It's not about avoiding making decisions. That outcome stays the same. It's just how you manage the situation, and that's what may need to be different. Managers, they should still expect good performance from their teams. They should still feel able to address issues. They should still be able to make decisions, but they just may need to adapt their timing or adjust their processes, or maybe take individual circumstances into account. So, what can you do about this? Well, there's a few simple things that you could do immediately that will make a difference. The first thing is to have a look at your current policies and processes and identify where they may need to be updated to align with these recent changes and the current best practice. And make sure that your managers are aware of the changes and what's now expected of them. Now, that might involve providing some extra support or training to help them feel more confident in handling issues early and compliantly. Maybe strengthen the leadership support or the HR support available to them to ensure they are aware of the routes that are available if they need to escalate problems, if they become a bit too complex for them to handle alone. And finally, as a business, aim to promote a culture of fairness and openness and consistency, because that will encourage the right workplace behaviours automatically. And I must say, most problems aren't caused by the situation, they're caused by how it's handled. So if you're getting these things right, then you're going to greatly reduce the risk of any problems for the business. So I hope that's given you a clear sense of the changes and how you need to prepare your managers for them. As I said, managers don't need to be legal experts, but they do need to know when to pause, when to ask the right questions, and to get support where needed. Now, what we've covered today is a high-level overview, but the Amber Group can help in several different ways. We have a range of sessions designed for managers where we go into more detail using real-life scenarios so they can practice handling situations in a structured and confident way, so they're ready when they go back into the workplace to put it all into practice. And that ranges from introduction courses for introduction into management through to when they become line managers and they are managing individuals and their career progression and are more likely to be dealing with some of the issues we talked about today. We also have workshops that look at specific areas such as crucial conversations, delivering feedback, running appraisals, setting performance goals. We do one-to-one coaching with managers if they've got anything they particularly want to work on or need to work on. And we also offer external HR guidance and support to help you make sure you've got the right things in place. So we'll be happy to talk if you want to know more about them. But for now, I'm going to pause and we can take any questions if there's any time left.
Thanks, Liz. Bang on time, 5 minutes left. Nice job. It's interesting to me, who's a sort of non-HR person, but sort of former agency, how the law is sort of subtly shifting in this area, and therefore the emphasis is sort of more on the employer and on the manager to get involved earlier and sort of document conversations and move them forward. So it's sort of one of those things you just need to keep an eye on, I think, and make sure everyone in the team who's managing people has a clarity about what they should be doing when. But we've got 5 minutes or so left. Does anyone have any questions? Haven't got any in the chat. So if anyone would like to add a question or a comment even on how they're handling this for others to hear, that would be useful. Anyone have a question that they want to offer?
If you don't, and if you do have any maybe sensitive issues that you would like to discuss, then I'm happy also to take it offline and do a call. So just let me know afterwards if you'd like me to do that instead. Here are all my contact details if you do want to get in touch.
Okay. No questions? Okay, great. All right.
Thank you. That's made it very easy for me.
Very easy. I'm going to finish bang on time. In fact, a little bit ahead. So thank you for attending today. Really appreciate it. This is the first sort of webinar that we've run in this area. We share a lot over the Agency Edge, which is our newsletter. which I guess is probably where a lot of you saw this initial information. If we continue to get interest in these topics, we may run some more in the future. But in the meantime, what we'll do is send everyone a copy of the video today, a copy of the deck, and then an opportunity, if you wish, to drop Liz a line and have a separate conversation about your own circumstances at your business. Then, of course, you're welcome to do that. Thanks, everyone, for attending today. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.